5 seconds. We're live.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Socialist Action webcast. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action and a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat and Haudenosaunee people, in a place called Toronto. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Recently, we celebrated the 111th anniversary of International Women's Day. The roots of the occasion on March the 8th go back to a women's conference of the Socialist International in Copenhagen in 1910, which launched International Women's Day globally in 1911. Trotskyist parties, including the predecessor organization of Socialist Action League for Action Socialist in the Canadian state, relaunched the modern IWD in Canada 44 years ago, in 1978. We did this for a good reason. Women's oppression is rooted in the capitalist system. Capitalist profits from heterosexism, racism, environmental destruction, and war. One of the worst features of capitalist rule is the denial of reproductive justice to people who identify as female, to trans folks and others who may have an unwanted pregnancy. Socialist Action and its predecessor parties have always been in the forefront of the pro-choice movement. In the 1960s, our slogan was, "Every mother is a willing mother, every child a wanted child." And so it is today, as the U.S. Supreme Court threatens to rule back the gains of women's liberation movement, and as right-wing forces in Canada, not only in the Conservative Party, seek to do the same. I am pleased to welcome two excellent speakers to tonight's webcast. And Montague is a leading member of our sister party in the United States, and Schade is a leader of Socialist Action Canada. So first, let's hear from Anne. She is a member of Socialist Action USA Political Committee based in Portland, Oregon, and is an activist with the Women's National Abortion Action Coalition prior to the Roe versus Wade decision. She's a writer for Socialist Action US and a member of the Service Employees International Union's National Lavender Caucus. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me and caring about what's happening to the South below there. So I'm glad to talk about a little bit about that. And also I'm looking forward to hearing about what's happening in Canada. I thought I'd start with a little bit of the history of how we got Roe v. Wade. In the beginning, that was a Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion in the first place. We got it from a conservative all-male Supreme Court in the midst of a predominantly conservative culture as far as sex was concerned. They were still pretty conservative in 1973. This was a time of a vibrant women's liberation movement, which was later called the Second Wave. And working class women at this time were demanding equal pay and jobs and childcare. At this time, classified ads for jobs had two sections: help wanted men and help wanted women. If you wanted to summarize working women's demands together with the middle class women, it was that they were fighting society's restrictive sex roles. In other words, equal rights, which resulted in a strong movement to get an equal rights amendment to the US Constitution. This never succeeded. The women's liberation movement came out of a general radicalization of a strong anti-war movement that was in the streets, as well as Black and Chicano liberation, and then in 1968, gay and lesbian liberation. These moments were at this time, independent, not promoted or dominated by the two capitalist parties. The high point of the women's liberation movement came on August 26th, 1970, when 50,000 feminists went on strike and walked out of work and marched down Fifth Avenue in New York City, linking arms and blocking traffic. In addition, thousands from around the country joined, demanding equal opportunity in employment, 24/7 free childcare, and yes, free abortion on demand. This was 1970. In the movement for abortion rights, as it expanded, the deaths of women from back alley abortions continued to mount. I was in the Young Socialist Alliance at that time, and we were involved in creating and building the Women's National Abortion Action Coalition, called WONAC. It brought together all the organizations and individuals working together on abortion rights and included Black women's organizations who were concerned about forced sterilization. In 1971, we called for regional conferences across the country to democratically discuss and decide on a coordinated course of action. The initial proposal was for a coordinated abortion campaign that included legal action, abortion speakouts, and demonstrations in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco in November 20th of that year. The demands that were agreed on were repeal of all abortion laws, end forced sterilization, and repeal of all laws restricting contraception. And the main slogan was abortion, a woman's right to choose. It's interesting. I want to mention the Democrats. They like to talk about right to choose, but they never say abortion, a woman's right to choose. In addition, they called for statewide campaigns. Over 30 women's liberation groups signed on. And in 1972, they called for the first week in May to be Abortion Action Week with high visibility on college campuses. It's amazing to think of the success of this mass action United Front campaign, which just started in 1971 and ended up seeing legislation of abortion in 1973 by a conservative Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked in a BBC interview a few years before her death, what can be done about the states in your country that are restricting abortion rights? She answered, there needs to be a movement like we had before the Roe v. Wade decision. Indeed. So where are we now? The unprecedented release of an early draft shows a majority of the justices on the U.S. Supreme Court are in agreement about the overturning of Roe v. Wade after 49 years, and then they would allow states to pass their own laws. The right to abortion has never been codified into federal law. At the same time, the Democrats for the last 5 decades have been haranguing women to give money to the Democratic Party to protect their rights, always just saying to protect your right to choose. They have done nothing, even when there has been a Democratic president and they had control of Congress. In addition, every year they have voted to reauthorize the Hyde Amendment that bans federal Medicaid money from being used to pay for abortions for poor women. The Democrats have demobilized every major attempt of women to organize independently of them, saying that electoral politics is the only way to protect your rights. So they have continued entering the swamp of the Democratic Party, who has done nothing substantial. Today, the anger is so explosive and the fear is so great, there exists an opportunity for a real fight back. It was interesting that the Women's March, a top-down organization, note top-down organization as opposed to Democratic regional meetings of WONAC, a top-down organization that is dominated by the Democrats, has stated the upcoming demonstrations that are called for Saturday are not endorsed by them, but are being organized locally. They claim no liability. This was interesting, but this could be, they have concerns about possible civil disobedience, which is not something they want to see. Or it could just be that they have no control. And when they have no top-down control, they don't want to have liability. For example, in past demonstrations that they organized, they actually banned certain images like coat hangers because they thought they were offensive to some. Of course, women disobeyed their edict, but the fact is that they thought that they could determine what the slogans and what images people could bring on their signs. The women who have been pouring into the streets are very diverse. Many women there have never used the word abortion. They have always just said choice. And there's now a growth of groups that say, shout your abortion. And I know it started in New York and I think Chicago, and it's been spreading. So the anger will continue to grow as the actual Supreme Court decision is not expected until late June. So it sort of gives an opportunity for either the activism to increase or decrease. I think it will increase. So that decision will come in late in June. The Supreme Court always kind of puts its controversial decisions at the end of June and then they go home. So that's why. There also has been more talk about civil disobedience. It should be noted that where there is a struggle against reformism, there is also ultraleftism. So not far from me in Salem, Oregon, there was a Molotov cocktail thrown and fire started at the Oregon Right to Life headquarters, and another one in the suburb of Portland. Of course, this is Portland. This is Oregon, where the anarchists tend to reign. But there are also beginning to develop more creative protests, like the loud nighttime picketing at the homes of Supreme Court Justice John Roberts and Neil Gorsuch, who apparently lived close together. And so they had kind of a roving, I don't think they had 200-300 people there. And they were roving between and marching between their two offices. It's important, of course, that as the Democrats hopefully lose their control of the abortion rights movement, that the mass action perspective will take hold, including a women's strike. The fact is that if we wait and focus on Democrats' action to codify Roe v. Wade, that they should have done 49 years ago, into federal law, we will wait forever. Within hours of the release of the written draft opinion, women were in the streets in front of the Supreme Court, and the following day, hundreds of women mobilized around the country. It is interesting that one of the largest mobilizations in Boston, where thousands of women showed up, and Boston was the center of the most militant arm of the women's liberation movement in the 1960s and 1970s. It's hard to imagine that women today are in any mood to be told what to do by anyone, especially Democratic Party bosses. The outrage is too great. More than 100 million women will lose access to safe and legal abortions. 26 states are ready to ban abortion immediately on the day the announcement of the decision. We cannot, however, underestimate the attempts of the Democratic Party to tell people that the midterm elections are the most important thing that they can do. Women's oppression has its roots in class society. The need for the capitalist class to control women's reproduction of the future working class. The ruling class is becoming concerned about the cost of labor as the birth rate declines, and it is declining. For women, this means an increase in unpaid labor, which will be required of them. In some countries, with a lowering of birth rates, the government underwrites the cost of childbearing with paid maternity leave, free childcare, universal health care, free schooling, housing subsidies, and cash payments, none of which women in the United States have. In the US, the labor and costs of bearing and raising a child is pushed onto the individual and added to the burden of women's unpaid labor. In regards to abortion rights, it seems like globally, the world is going in a different direction than the United States. In 2018, through militant mass action, the women of Ireland won the repeal of their country's constitutional ban on abortion. The women's movement in Argentina won a long struggle in 2021 to win legal abortion. Since 2000, 31 countries have expanded access to abortion, including South Korea, Thailand, and Benin. One of the most important victories through mass action was in Poland, and I think this is an important one for us. So I wanted to give a little bit more detail on this particular struggle. So So their struggle was to hold back the hand of a misogynist white right-wing party and their collaborators in Poland's patriarchal Catholic Church. In October 2016, there were massive protests throughout Poland. On October 3rd, over 7 million women turned out to defend their basic reproductive rights. There was a proposed law coming from the right-wing ruling Law and Justice Party. It included prison sentences of up to 5 years for any woman who terminated her pregnancy, and called for a formal investigation of any woman who had a miscarriage. This sparked the largest women's movement in Polish history. They not only protested the proposed law, but demanded liberalization of the present law. Tens of thousands of women went on strike, and students boycotted their classes throughout Poland. On that day, 30,000 women dressed in black gathered in the rain in Warsaw Castle Square, chanting, "We want doctors, not missionaries," referring to the church's collaboration with the government in bringing forth the new law, and "My uterus, my opinion." Women were ecstatic about the support of the massive actions. One activist told the press, "It was amazing to feel the energy and anger. The emotional intensity was incredible. When the rally in Warsaw was too big for the square organizers, they led them to a march to Parliament, paralyzing traffic in the city center of Warsaw for 2 hours. As a result of strikes, the ruling Law and Justice Party had Parliament withdraw the bill. A former prime minister commented, they backtracked because they were scared of all the women who hit the streets in protest. But the most important aspect of this struggle, and a lesson for us all, was verbalized by one of the organizers. This victory has empowered Polish women. We will never be the same. After the protest, something snapped. Our struggle with the politicians and the church is not over, but we will keep fighting. There is so much solidarity among Polish women right now. I have never been so proud of all the empowered women. We will never be the same again. Now in the United States, we have to work to make sure our current struggle empowers women, and not the Democratic Party, to keep fighting against all areas of our oppression rooted in the capitalist system. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much. Now let's hear from Florencia Schade. Flo is a leading member of Socialist Action based in Wet'suwet'en Territory, near a place called Burns Lake in northern British Columbia. She is the mother of 2 children who just turned 5 and 6 years old. She is a humanist who believes economic justice is fundamental to the realization of all forms of justice. Welcome, Flo.
Hi, thanks everyone for having me. So I'm joining you from Wet'suwet'en land, territory of the Gilsayu Big Frog clan of the Yet'suwet'en Thin House. I'll begin also, as Anne did, with the history of the progression of reproductive rights in Canada. The historical landscape looks very different from that of the United States. However, there are also many parallels, lessons, and shared concerns that cross beyond all national boundaries to bring fundamental insights into liberatory struggles against gender oppression. In Canada, abortion had been made explicitly illegal and a chargeable offense in 1869, 2 years after the nation's founding. And it was federally codified in 1892 through the first Criminal Code Act, Section 251, which also banned homosexuality and contraceptives. The penalty for this was up to life imprisonment for abortion providers and 2 years imprisonment for women who procured it. This prohibition stayed in place for an entire century until 1969, when Pierre Trudeau's government introduced the Omnibus Criminal Amendment Act, which sought to liberalize these laws in accordance with the political momentum brought about by the civil rights movement and second wave feminism. However, this bill still put unreasonable conditions on access to abortion, in that it was only legal if the pregnancy was found to jeopardize the life or health of the pregnant person, as according to a therapeutic abortion committee, which was supposed to consist of a panel of 3 hospital physicians. There was widespread variations, inequities, and obstacles with this system, as only 1/3 of hospitals actually formed these committees. The vague language led to no standard for decision-making. It was structurally out of reach for many rural, immigrant, or low-income individuals, and the slow bureaucratic pace often took weeks to deliver an answer at all. Even after this amendment, many women tragically died from complications associated with performing home or illegal abortions. The most common complication being septic poisoning after an infection or hemorrhaging to death because they were too afraid to seek hospital treatment, assuming they would be charged as a criminal. During this time, many women would be pumped with Lysol to effect a miscarriage by nurses and practitioners who were prohibited access to safe tools and medical resources. They'd throw themselves downstairs, ingest black market herbs and chemicals, or after 1973, travel down to the United States to get an abortion. However, the feeble movements of the Liberal government in modernizing archaic and unethical restrictions on women's bodies did not satisfy the growing public consciousness, which sought liberation in areas of sexuality, gender, and civil rights. Famously, there was an abortion caravan in 1970, which consisted of a small convoy, including a pickup truck with a coffin that was stuffed with coat hangers, and drove from Vancouver to Ottawa, protesting the continued restrictions, and resulting in 35 women chaining themselves to the House of Commons. What's truly notable here is the convergence of social forces which enacted these protests. There was always a strong anti-capitalist sentiment in women's liberation movements, as it's long been understood by socialists that capitalism perpetuates gender depression by structuring social reproduction in ways which prioritize the needs of capital, such as ensuring a consistent supply of labor force and creating atomized nuclear family units, which maximize individual consumption, while devaluing the real human needs of mass society and crippling the potential of individuals. During the active time of the 70s and 80s, one individual stands out as a pioneer, Dr. Henry Morgentaler, whose courageous actions ultimately resulted in the Supreme Court finding the 1969 law in contravention to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So we were left with the result, still currently in effect, that Canada has no federal abortion law and that abortion is treated as a medical procedure regulated by professional healthcare bodies, just as anything else is in medicine. There is no federal restriction or time limit on abortion. However, most providers still don't offer them after 23 weeks unless medically necessary. Dr. Henry Morgentaler was a Holocaust survivor who moved to Montreal from Poland, and in the 1970s opened up a series of clinics which provide determinations for women who hadn't been approved by a therapeutic abortion committee, directly challenging the law at the time. What's interesting to note is that while the state was intent on prosecuting Dr. Morgentaler and did so multiple times, even going so far as to overturn a jury decision, which resulted in his imprisonment for 10 months, every single jury acquitted him and refused to convict. Eventually, in 1976, after the third jury acquittal, the Quebec government, who had initially brought the charges, deemed them unenforceable and dropped the pursuit. It was at that point that private clinics were free to practice in Quebec, setting a precedent for the expansion of rights across the nation. It's during this active time that we really see a coalescence of solidarity and the promise of a mass united front movement to enact revolutionary social change. Morgentaler became an obvious figurehead, but he was far from alone in creating this movement. receiving support from activist groups such as Canadian Abortion Rights Action League, now known as the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada. Women comrades of the Fourth International were involved from the start. However, the movement included more liberal feminist groups, trade unionists, civil rights and Indigenous rights activists, among others. There was a critical interplay between the electoral, legislative, and judicial efforts, as well as grassroots organizing from the various activist groups, which would not only demonstrate on the streets, but would quite literally serve to protect Morgentaler's clinics from increasing fanatical harassment and violence from the anti-abortion right. One of our recently passed Socialist Action founding members, Robbie Mahood, was actually a medical doctor that provided abortions and had worked in one of Dr. Morgentaler's early opened clinics, where he and his family were subject to constant abuse and harassment by anti-choice activists who would also picket outside of his home. And yet he did not relent, but worked on the ground and in the clinic to continue expanding the realization of reproductive justice. Socialists, particularly the revolutionary Trotskyist tendency, have a long and rich demonstrated history of working to create meaningful changes in causes of liberatory struggle. This, I believe, is due to the nuanced understanding of dialectic interplay between the various forces and institutions of society. Rather than eschewing components in the name of ideological purity, the focus remains on enacting material change through all means available. The priority is the progressive realization of socialist values and furthering the autonomy of the working class. To prepare the conditions appropriately so that we can one day be in a position to overtake the system completely. To this end, it's very important to understand that the social movements which preceded the 1988 ruling consciously chose to create a broad-based coalition which sought to expand the meaning of choice in reproductive justice. As activist Carolyn Egan describes in her 2012 article, How We Won Abortion Rights, the movement in Canada placed the issue of abortion within a broader reproductive rights perspective. When it spoke of a woman's right to choose, it referred to a whole range of women's issues. The right to childcare and a decent job, to an end to forced sterilizations, employment equity, birth control services in our own languages, and full access to free abortion, all of which were required if women were to have real choices. As stated, the success of the movement consciously linked up with United Front groups to create a mass network dedicated to a common cause, and achieved this by placing abortion rights within a justice framework of autonomy, which was relevant to variegated groups. We must remember this now, as anti-choice evangelists are primed to go back on the offensive, both in the US and Canada, and be prepared with a response. Even up to the 90s and early 2000s, there have been acts of violence, including firebombing and assassination attempts on abortion providers' lives. It's not a safe situation, and one in which the right-wing groups are eager to exploit at the earliest opportunity. It must be noted that many times after the 1988 ruling, there have been attempts to restrict the right to choose, perhaps most notably within that first year in 1989, when the Mulroney government actually passed a bill through the House of Commons restricting abortion to once again be medically necessary as determined by the individual and their physician. This was defeated in the Senate only because it was a tie vote, with the expectation that the Supreme Court would likely strike this law down as well. However, that assumption isn't set in stone either, as the legal grounding for the 1988 Supreme Court decision was based on the 1969 abortion law, contravening Section 7 of the Charter, which states that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. Now, while 3 judges found the law to infringe upon an individual's right to security of the person, they critically found that infringement was not justified because of the structural barriers placed by the law's mandating of therapeutic abortion committees. And the resulting inequities was not in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. So if you'll indulge my jurisprudence nerd brain here for a moment, to me, that means that we aren't on as solid ground as most Canadians assume when it comes to these rights. Critically, there was never a majority opinion in the court that there's a substantive right to abortion under Section 7. Rather, the deciding factor was found on procedural grounds due to the inefficiencies of the committee system. That makes me rather uncomfortable because it theoretically means if a more perfect, equitable, efficient system for doctor-prescribed abortion legislation was put forward, it still has a chance. While handing over bodily autonomy to a panel of doctors is clearly an infringement on the security of the person, depending on who the judges and politicians are at the time, they may find that to be a justifiable infringement, as long as it happens in an efficient manner. And of course, a huge problem in Canada remains lack of unequal access to abortions, which still puts up barriers for low-income and rural people, which happens to coincide with Indigenous populations. While abortion procedure is covered under federal funding, except in New Brunswick, where one clinic still refuses to comply with covering services, it's often logistically or financially difficult to travel to these places where abortion clinics are available. Particularly as well, because consistent attacks on abortion providers have meant a lot of information about accessing providers, particularly in rural conservative areas, is private and requires multiple steps to access. There have been other subsequent court cases setting precedent in favor of the women's rights over that of the fetus, and other failed legislative attempts at rolling back and restricting abortion rights. But if the recent events in America tell us anything, it's that we cannot rely on the whims of bourgeois judges and politicians to protect our fundamental human rights for us. There is and will always continue to be a need to stay vigilant and active in this manner, to never cede the streets or any other arena to the fanatical anti-choice activists, who I refuse to call pro-life. We have all seen in real time how ideological campaigns driven by rich zealots can and do infiltrate a corrupt and viable political democracy. At the very least, I think we could put forward transitional demands of specifically enshrining the right to reproductive autonomy in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, so that no procedural argument could even potentially threaten to restrict it. To cover all travel-related expenses for accessing abortions, and to charge the Fredericton Clinic with malpractice and contravention of the Canada Health Act, unless it makes its abortions free. And much like movements from the past, we must challenge ourselves to broaden the meaning of reproductive rights to be the most inclusive and progressive and far-reaching for the interests of the working classes. To this end, I would say it's absolutely vital to include gay, transgender, disabled, and Indigenous rights into this framework, as these populations' reproductive autonomy has been historically marginalized, regulated, or outlawed by the state. Sadly, the issue of forced sterilizations in Indigenous people was not resolved through this push, and in fact, forced and coerced sterilization still happens to this day. Indigenous bodies, particularly Indigenous women or two-spirited bodies, have been policed, used, discarded, devalued, and ultimately treated like property since colonial contact. This cannot abide. The right to choose means the right to choose to continue birthing children as well. This fundamental right has been sickeningly denied to Indigenous and disabled folks for centuries based on racist and eugenicist notions of population control, social control, and the craven fears of white supremacists. Trans folks similarly have a dog in this fight, not only as trans men can become pregnant and deserve an equal standard of care, but we are seeing ramping up efforts to sabotage, regulate, and control how transgender people choose to manage their own bodies, and vehement displays of outrage over hormonal therapies and the creation of safe spaces, already making their way into legislative efforts in some parts of the US, such as Florida's infamous Don't Say Gay bill. But the fundamental right still stands: their body, their choice. At the risk of opening up a huge can of worms, I think it's only responsible to mention as well that the discussion over vaccine mandates, bodily autonomy, and coercive state efforts will probably take a prominent place in these debates and has already entered the discourse to some extent. I can't say I have a perfectly developed position on this, but it had occurred to me that depending on the demands put forward, anti-mandate activists could potentially become an ally in a coalition to see bodily autonomy enshrined as a right. Maybe that's just overly idealistic, but we should at least begin to think about what a unified response to the charge of hypocrisy should be. What's certain is that we cannot afford to give up. The anti-choice activists will never completely retreat, and this has been shown time and time again in Canadian history. Our rights are never completely safe, particularly when they're left up to the vagaries of the bourgeois democracy, which only serves to reinforce oppressive structures so long as they maintain the status quo for the capitalist profiteers. This fundamental injustice of capitalism, profits over people, is what constrains all democratic and mass efforts, no matter how popular they are on the ground. The realization of radical change requires the participation of the masses, which it will affect. Nothing is safe so long as it exists in a political economic system that makes a farce of democracy a mere facade for appearance of civility, though remains a system which protects the rich minority at the continued expense and exploitation of the majority. It makes the threshold for change unbelievably high. The only sectarian interests that can be realized in that system are ones which protect and reinforce it. Anything seeking to challenge that power will require a lot of people and a lot of noise. What we can learn from our predecessors is that the good fight is never over, but as long as we draw upon solidarity with working and oppressed peoples all over the world, we can win. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Flo. Okay, so now we're going to go to our technical producer, and he will read, you'll find the questions in the chat, but he will also read the questions, and each panelist will have up to 6 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3. It's their choice. And we will start with Anne and then Flo. Dave?
So the first question comes from Ellen Ramsey. For Anne, has anyone in the US actually figured out what they will do with all those unwanted babies? Is there paid maternity leave for those mothers, good daycare, or a good foster system in place? The second question comes from Hans Modlich. Anne, do you think that the amazing Polish experience, this massive women's backlash against reaction, will also happen in the USA? And I'll pose that to Flo as well in the context of Canada. Third question comes from Barry Weisletter. They ask, how has the abortion rights movement played a vanguard role in the struggle for women's equality on all levels?
Okay, thank you, Dave. So we will go to Anne, then Flo. You each have up to 6 minutes.
Okay, now did you say answer 1 or 2 or?
No, you can answer 1, 2, or 3. It's your choice.
Oh, okay.
Answer all 3.
Okay, I think I'm going to answer Ellen's question because it kind of relates to what the new woman justice on the court who came from an extremely well, let's see, I don't know how to put this. She came from an extremely right-wing position, and hers was basically that that women should continue to be pregnant and then just give their babies over to foster care. But the fact is that there are none of these things that Ellen mentioned. We don't have paid maternity leave. We don't have daycare, excuse me, or a good foster care system. So I think that, really the question is that no one has actually figured out these things because it's just a rhetorical point that's made by one of the judges. So the question is that, would that be a reason for women not to be able to make their own decision for themselves as to whether or not they wanted to have children? And so I don't really see anyone seriously showing a way that that we can have another choice other than that. Sorry. Go ahead, Flo.
Okay. Yeah, so in terms of the second question, well, the Polish experience happened in Canada in terms of a massive backlash. I mean, hopefully, I do feel like this time right now is kind of an opportunity, I guess, in a way, like just reading about the history of the Canadian movement and, talking to Elizabeth and Gary and Barry and hearing Robbie and like all of the socialists that are involved in this organization that were involved on the ground back then too. Like it definitely seems like, the message I keep hearing was that it was about more than just the one issue and just, you know, the one organization, that there was a mass movement. Obviously, you know, civil rights and feminism and the sexual revolution. And, you know, there was a something in the air, I think, culturally, that wanted a lot of change. And I do feel like we're in that kind of moment again, too. Obviously, people are very discontent and worried about the future. And so this might just kind of be the spark, you know. It's like, how far backwards are we going to go? And things are just getting kind of like absurd. It's like absurd levels of cognitive dissonance and stuff like that. So hopefully we can sort of seize onto those feelings and that momentum to, you know, make sure that reproductive rights and reproductive justice is available to everyone. Anybody that can become pregnant, and, well, really, like any person, right? Like, I'm sure some people have seen the like liberal reaction on Twitter to be like, well, let's forcibly, you know, give men vasectomies. It's like, that's not the answer, you know. So really, reproductive autonomy, that's kind of what I've been centering on. People have the right to make choices about their own bodies. And, you know, pregnancy is it's a real experience. You don't just like go through 9 months of being pregnant and you're like the same after, you know. So I feel like that whole argument is completely absurd too. Just give them up, you know, like that's not how it works. Your body goes through a lot. So people shouldn't have to endure that if that's not what they want. In terms of the abortion rights movement playing a vanguard role, I feel like I maybe sort of touched on that a bit during my speech, but yeah, that is something that really stuck out to me, that it, like, in order to have any success, people in the movement very conspicuously, it seemed like, really tried to bring different groups in, different aspects in, and create a mass movement. And, you know, obviously the only way to do that is by appealing to issues that are relevant to just sort of show how everybody has a stake in this. And, you know, socialists are good at that. That goes right back to socialist theory, I think, in terms of egalitarian sort of power relations and, you know, not wanting to exploit people just because you can. And so, yeah, I think it's another sort of opportunity to hopefully bring all of that discourse out again, and maybe, you know, maybe even do some more United Front campaigns.
Okay, thank you, Flo. Okay, so we'll go back to our producer again for 3 more questions. You each will have up to 6 minutes to answer, and we will start with Flo and then Anne. Dave?
The first question comes from Judy Kosh. Could you go into the Cuban abortion law? The second question comes from Robert McDermott. Can you comment on the degeneration of the women's movement from radical roots to middle class breaking the glass ceiling? The third question comes from Mark Kosatsky. Please comment also on the right to RU486, the morning after pill.
Okay, you have up to 6 minutes, and we will start with Flo.
Okay, so Cuban abortion law. I'm definitely not an expert, but I did in my readings just read one article about Cuba, so I can tell you what I know. It says that as soon as the revolution happened, that was one of the first things. I mean, abortion was legalized. I don't think there's any restrictions on it. They had a woman heading up the Ministry of like Families and something like this. So ever since the revolution, that's been very accessible, and reproductive rights and women's equality seems to have been like a top level concern. But they also have, on the other end, like a lot of, you know, obviously progressive social programs. Daycare is fully funded and paid for. Healthcare is fully funded and paid for. So the the wraparound supports are there as well. And then I read just something interesting that was saying that now they're trying to tackle actually low birth rate or increase the birth rate. But, you know, being Cuba, I feel like it's they're going more the sort of structural and incentive route. Like they're not forcing people to have children. Like, you know, Stalin kind of took those back because he, I guess my understanding of it is that, you know, he decided they needed more bodies for the war and they were worried about their population. So he revoked abortion rights. But Cuba has just put a lot of funding into fertility clinics and treatments and expanding childcare and healthcare and all of those things. So I'd say they're doing pretty good about in terms of reproductive justice down there. Commenting on the degeneration of the women's movement, from radical roots to middle class breaking the glass ceiling. I mean, that just seems to follow the same neoliberal tilt as everything else. I feel like it's just become very vacuous. And, you know, it's exactly the kind of thing that I would hope that if, you know, people are finally getting outraged enough to go out onto the streets, that can be changed and sort of brought back, and the radical roots and explaining, you know, that tyranny and oppression anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as Martin Luther King has said, and just bringing back some actual solidarity and the class consciousness of the fight for liberation. You know, like this could hopefully be an opportunity for that. But I also just saw a little video on Twitter. I think it was of the squad. A few members of the squad were like, it was their protest, but they were walking across the marble hall of the Senate, and like then they were done. So, you know, we can't count on them, you know, and I think that's going to become more and more clear that it really does have to be a grassroots initiative. And then the right to the morning after pill. I mean, I don't know what to say about that other than it's absolutely a right. It needs to be accessible and free as well. My understanding is that actually the pandemic has kind of, because of telehealth becoming more like ubiquitous, that it's actually a bit more accessible than previously, because you can get a prescription over the phone and pick it up at a pharmacy. So hopefully that just stays put and it doesn't meet any more barriers. I think in the United States, that's something that's probably going to become threatened pretty quickly. That's all.
Okay, Anne, you're up.
Yes, I think Flo did a good job talking about the degeneration of the women's movement. One of the things that did contribute in the United States is the rise of so-called private nonprofits, and that were not oriented, you know, like Planned Parenthood Foundation and their PACs and everything that's oriented towards the Democratic Party. So, and I'm not sure what the situation is in Canada, but it's just rife in the United States. In terms of talk about the pill, I think it's mephisterone, which is called the abortion pill, which is different than the morning after. But there has been discussion if that states will treat it like they do drugs in terms of mailing. But I've also heard figures that right now around 50% of abortions are done through the pill and with a combination of telemedicine, and that it is very safe. But I'm sure if this goes through like it looks like it is, there will be definitely, they'll try to add it to the prohibited drugs in interstate traffic.
Okay, thank you, Anne. So we'll go back to Dave for a third round. So you will each have the same up to 6 minutes, and we will start with Anne and then Flo.
The first question comes from Daniel Franklin. I know many states in the US already restrict abortion. Will the overturning of Roe actually restrict access further than it currently is? The second question is, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Liberties makes no mention of reproductive rights, much less women's right to abortion. Should women and their allies focus on a constitution amendment or focus on other tactics? The third question is, should gay women and transsexual people have the right to abortion?
Okay. First, I would like to address the state issues. So right now, what they're looking at is that these state laws are going, the decision that's going to be made that they claim are going to overthrow Roe is actually the cases force these state abortion laws, particularly in Mississippi. So, so I think I'm not sure if some of those restrictions are actually taking effect. It's like they were getting all prepared and getting all the legislation prepared for the overturn of Roe. So that's kind of there. I was going to just comment on the last question that anyone who is pregnant should have a right to an abortion. I don't think it should matter sexual orientation, gender identity.
Okay, Flo.
Okay. Yeah. So the second question was, about Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And yeah, definitely. Like, I think that's a good, at least a good transitional demand, aside from, abolishing the Supreme Court, taking over and all that. But that's exactly kind of in my reading of stuff why I became more nervous. And I do feel more of a sense of kind of urgency knowing how the court proceedings went down, because they didn't explicitly find that there is a substantive right to abortion, even under that Section 7, the right to security and stuff like that. So it could very well, something could very well happen. I feel like a lot of Canadians think that it's just so safe and that there's no way that, it could be overturned, but I don't think any of this stuff is very safe. As we've seen in the States, even a few months ago, a lot of people just didn't think it was a practical reality that Roe would be overturned. So having something that in the charter that explicitly spells out, reproductive rights, I think is it's very least that we could do. I mean, a law is, again, even more easily overturned, depending on how they would interpret it and square it with the Constitution. So I think, our Constitution being the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And on an interesting note there too, what I believe what I had read is I can never remember his name without reading it. Morgenthaler, his first court challenge, they had actually used the Canada's Bill of Rights, so a different document, and that actually failed. So it was due to the sort of specific language of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that the 1988 challenge went through. So, it's all on some dubious grounds as of yet. And I mean, we're always going to see the slow creep and the rolling back and the deterioration of these rights, through provincial actions, like what happened in New Brunswick, similar to what's happening in the States right now, with different states enacting their own laws. So we do need to be vigilant. I think at least a good starting point would be seeking a an amendment in the charter to make it explicit. And then the third one, yes, of course, gay and transgender, transsexual people should have rights to a free abortion. It's still their body and still their choice.
Thank you. So we'll go back to Dave for our last 3 questions. And you each have up to 6 minutes, and we will start once again with Anne and then Flo. Dave?
The first question is, how does the pro-choice movement exemplify the United Front tactic in bringing about significant social change? The second question is, should women after menopause have the right to choose to adopt a child if they want? Third question is, why should a revolutionary workers' party, which Socialist Action strives to build, see choice on abortion as a key demand and movement?
Okay, we will start with Anne, and then Flo, you have up to 6 minutes. You're muted, Anne.
Okay. First of all, anyone should have a choice for adoption. I don't see. I haven't heard this, this question before, but I think. Adoption is done through agencies. They do interviews, and as long as you're capable of being a parent, I don't think that should be a problem. I might just mention too, in terms of pro-choice United Front, I mean, this is something that has to be established in the United States. I mean, right now, the Democratic Party is so dominant, has so much money, and has so much top-down control of the movement. So, but what I'm seeing in the last, whatever it was, not very long, there's so much anger. I can't imagine that there's not going to be anger towards the Democratic Party. And we're going to have to, there are a number of new groups that are coming out that are more left-oriented, and groups like Shout Your Abortion, because these are young women who have never lived when they didn't have this right. And so it's kind of their birthright, you might say. And so I'm really hoping that these groups will be able to come together for a united front on, the right to abortion. And I mean, that's the big question right now. And it's really too early. What I've sort of been saying is, I'm seeing 2 things. I'm seeing such anger, and I'm seeing such fear. And I'm concerned that if fear overrides the anger, that it is just so oppressive with the rest of things that women have to deal with. That there'll be an emphasis on getting abortions for women across state, which is certainly something that's important, but there also has to, be a strong united front around your basic right to abortion also.
Flo?
David, can you repeat the third question? I've forgotten it.
Yeah. Why should a revolutionary workers' party, which Socialist Action strives to build, see choice on abortion as a key demand and movement?
Okay. Well, I think I'll answer like maybe 1 and 3 at the same time kind of thing. So the United Front tactic, and why should a revolutionary organization see abortion rights as a key demand? I think because it's just one of the most like basic forms of oppression to not even be able to, control what happens to your own body. And like I was saying, like getting pregnant is like a big deal. Like, I don't know, maybe some people have lucky pregnancies out there, but I mean, most don't. It like, changes your rib cage, like I was sick for 9 months. It's just your hormones go insane. Like it's like not for the faint of heart, like, and then childbirth. I mean, forcing somebody to go through that is like absolutely horribly oppressive and insane. And, I think that's just something that it's so visceral and so like right in front of your face, especially if you have a uterus, that it's just so easy to understand how it is oppressive and wrong. And that's kind of why I think a united front tactic is necessary and can be successful and can work for a revolutionary organization as well, because it's like people are drawn into the need and like the visceral desire to protect these rights. But, when you're on the ground and you're in the streets with people, that's an opportunity to build, class consciousness, and which is built through the experience of fighting against the system, right? And I think, too, this is definitely happening in the States, I hope, but I mean, it's becoming more clear that leaving it up to bureaucrats and politicians and, elite, their entire sphere, it's not going to do anything. The Democrats had supermajority, they had decades to do something about it. And to me, it was just more cynically used as like a leverage and to get people to vote and to bludgeon them to the polls, basically, so they haven't done anything. They won't do it for you. And that's never been how it worked before, even previously, in Canadian history. All we have to do is look back. Like Pierre Trudeau would have been totally happy to just leave it with this, the therapeutic abortion committees, which just sound like a nightmare to me. Like, yeah. But that's he would have been fine with that. Everybody would have been okay with that. It had to come from the streets, from people chaining themselves to the House of Commons, demonstrations. The trade unionists got involved too, and everybody. It sounds like everybody kind of provided a different thing, and I know that a lot of the trade unions donated resources so that the clinics could remain open. People went there to protect the women and the families and the doctors from harassment. So you need a united front effort to build, I think, revolutionary consciousness and potential. And this is just a very blatant way. Like, it's not that the system and the government and, social control is trying to oppress people. So they're already there, and it's like, let's meet people where they're at and bring people together, and through that experience kind of build that consciousness so that they can understand that that's what it takes for every other liberatory struggle too. Like, you can't just go to the vote and expect your minimum wage to go up, or to suddenly get restitution for Indigenous people, or become co-owners in big oil, and none of all of the changes that pretty much everyone wants to see. It just depends on us, and not depending on these bourgeois politicians to do the job, because we all know that they're owned by big money. And so, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So this brings us to the end of our evening. If you agree with what you heard during this program, please join Socialist Action. Just sign up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or by calling us at 647-986-1917. So special thanks to Anne and to Flo, and to our technical producer, Dave Enning in Toronto, and Barry Weisletter, the political producer of the webcast. Please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website, www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to Socialist Action Canada at gmail.com, or as I said, just give us a call. This show has been recorded and can be seen on the Socialist Action YouTube channel. So if you haven't subscribed to the Socialist Action YouTube channel, please do so. The next essay webcast will be on Thursday, May the 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The topic is, what is the cause of inflation? Featuring D.K. Cochran, economist and policy researcher for Canadians for Tax Fairness, and Gary Porter, British Columbia organizer for Socialist Action, and also a retired accountant, chartered accountant. That's on Thursday, May the 26th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. In the meantime, comrades, friends, please be safe, stay healthy, and stay active. Bye for now.